In June of 1988, John had the honor of receiving the James Madison First Amendment Award from the Freedom of Information Foundation of Texas. On a more personal note, I had the pleasure of spending the evening with John last night, and I can assure you that he is a man of great knowledge and activism, both in First Amendment rights and current political events. John is also a man of great courage, as I found out last evening. Please join me in welcoming back our scholar-in-resident, John Henry Falk, for his third visit to Iowa State.
Thank you, and it's sure good to be back, and thank you, Angel. That was a lovely introduction. Did she get in there that I was real courageous? Because I told her that 5 times. That's a much better introduction, honey, than I'm accustomed to. About 6 months ago, I was down in Beedize, Texas, speaking to the Chamber of Commerce down there, and the man supposed to introduce me wasn't on hand. And they dragooned old Jake Howard, who's a rancher that I know down there, into doing. He said, I'll introduce him if that's the only way you're going to get this thing going. And so he got up and says, I just know 2 things about John Henry Falk. Number 1, he ain't never been in the Texas penitentiary. And number 2, I don't know why. But I'm absolutely delighted to be back here and I have a terrific fondness for Iowa State and most of the folks here that I've met and enjoyed very much. As you heard, I'm a man of courage. It's not generally known, and it wasn't touched on in my biography. I've taken it out because it takes a long time to explain it usually. In my early days, I was in law enforcement, and I was in the Texas Rangers. You've probably heard of the mighty Rangers. I was a Texas Ranger. As a matter of fact, I was a captain of the Rangers. And I was closely associated with another man you might have heard of in law enforcement on the frontier at that time. His name was Boots Cooper. He was United States Marshal in our part of the country. He and I had our offices together, and we rode the frontier and kept, at a time when it was a very dangerous and very dubious business. It took great courage, the kind of courage it took to forge our nation, to drive us across this great land. Boots and I was in charge of the operation, although he was a United States officer and I was just a Texas Ranger. Outranked him in age. Boots I was a year older than he was. He was just 11. And we rode the frontier, that section of it that stretched between Mama's back door and our cow lot, and hunted marauding Indians, outlaw Indians, and bank robbers and cattle rustlers. And long before the Pentagon invented a body count, we had one going wide open, Boots and I would. Old Boots would say, how many did you kill yesterday? I said, I killed 533 bank robbers out behind the corn crib. He says, that all? I killed 700 cattle rustlers down there close to the hog trough. And I learned something very important from that. Never be the first liar in Texas. But that's an example of my frontier life. It was roughed and rugged. One morning, Mama called out the back door and said, would you mighty lawmen go out to the hen house? There's a chicken snake in one of those hen's nests out there. Would you all go out there and execute him? And old Boots and I galloped up on our stick horses and put them aside and charged into the hen house, and the hens were in a state of acute agitation, craning their necks and cackling. And Mama's hen's nests were in tiers of 3, and the top tier of nest we had to stand on tiptoe. We were both barefooted, had to stand on tiptoe to peek into. And about the 3rd top tier nest we peeked into, chicken snake peeked out of. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever had the experience of viewing a chicken snake from 6 inches from the end of your nose, but it don't have to be any bigger around than your thumb or your index finger to look like a damn boa constrictor. Old Boots and I both viewed it at the same moment, and all of our frontier courage drained out our heels. To be more accurate with y'all, it trickled down our overalls legs. Boots and I made a new door through the hen house wall. And Mama came out there, heard the commotion and the racket, and said, "Lord have mercy, y'all lured me into a sense of false security. I thought I was safe from all hurt and harm, and you've let a chicken snake run you out of the hen house, for goodness sake. Don't you know chicken snakes are harmless? They can't hurt you." And Boots, rubbing his bruised seat of his breeches and his bruised head at the same time, said, "Yes, sir, Miss Falk, I know they can't hurt you, but they'll scare you so bad it'll cause you to hurt yourself." And that's more or less what I want to talk to you all about tonight. Not chicken snakes per se, but what happens to a freewheeling people like us, the mightiest nation on the face of the earth, the people who take great pride in their courage and their freedom, their liberties, proclaim them to the sky constantly, and fool with them a little, and then darned if they won't pledge allegiance to the flag on you right on the spot. Courageous people we are. What happens to us when such a free society as ours give way to the cave-in of fear, when fear takes over? Back in the period that they now call the McCarthy era, named for Senator Joe McCarthy, I was in New York in radio and television, and the country began to go a bit mad. It was right after World War II, and we'd entered a brand new world, loves. What had happened was we had invented supersonic jet travel. We had created instantaneous communication around the globe. We had entered the nuclear age, all simultaneously, it seemed, at the end of that war. And we lived in a brave new world, in a frightening world, and lent itself perfectly to exploitation. And they grew up in this country a fear of communism. Our ally during World War II, and our very gallant ally, as a matter of fact, the ones that bore the principal brunt of Hitler's war, was the Soviet Union, communist country. That for years before World War II, and then beginning immediately after World War II, we had loathed and despised and suspected. Soviet Union had lost 25 million people, and millions of acres of their land had been laid barren in wilderness by Hitler's minions. But we entered that period that came to be called the Cold War, and we were told in this country, because as I say, it was a new world we were living in, we were told that we were threatened by an international communist conspiracy. See, we'd had the hell scared out of us, tell you the truth about it, by the fact the Soviet Union had for 3 years held Hitler off by themselves. We hadn't helped them any. That is, we weren't fighting the main war. We hadn't opened the second front until 3 years after Hitler attacked the Soviet Union. They fought him alone, and they lost their millions at him. Hitler ravaged their land, but they held him and turned him around and started him back toward Germany. And this alarmed our leadership, alarmed the people who thought in this country. They said, wait a minute, Russia's more powerful than we thought it was. Well, they're supposed to have caved in long ago. And here they are the ones that bore the main brunt of the war and lost billions of dollars and land laid waste and people. So it set up in our thinking a kind of an anxiety about what kind of monster Russia was that could stop Hitler. See, he hadn't been stopped at that time. He had gone through Europe like a knife through wet butter, warm butter. He just, zoom, he went tearing across the map. Nobody had even slowed him down till he hit Russia. So, we get to the post-war period. I've gone to New York to be a radio star. I'm at CBS, and they pay me to talk, which is the easiest way I ever heard of to make a living. I'd been a school teacher before that down in Texas, which will give you a notion at the University of Texas. Give you a notion of how hard up they were for school teachers in those days. But I really taught down there. My speech was considered impeccable. And I get up there in New York, and I've got this job. I'm chopping in the tall cotton, and the world's treating me terribly well. But this hysteria began to creep over the land. A number of engines were at work. There was the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover, who began to discover communists, that actually the New Deal had been a communist plot, and that Roosevelt had allowed the communist conspiracy to get its bony hand right on the front door of the White House, and that you couldn't tell where the next communist would creep up. And every 2 or 3 weeks they would come out. One of the committees in Washington, either the Senate Internal Security Committee or the House Un-American Activities Committee, would show up with a witness who said, yes, I used to be a communist and I was plotting and planning to overthrow the United States of America. I was part of this dread communist plot to overthrow the United States. And if you had common sense, you'd look around and say, well, where have they overthrown anything? Hell, they've never been able to elect anybody even to a city council of New York City, where the communists were the most numerous. And they sure ain't taken over Des Moines, Iowa yet. Matter of fact, they haven't been able to find any there. And so what is our great threat? Well, that's asking a rational question in an irrational period, because they were manipulating fear. And what began to take place in this country was that we discovered that the international communist conspiracy consisted almost entirely of people who dissented, people who criticized the House Committee, or who criticized the establishment, and who raised questions about it. And they're proliferated all over the United States, these vigilante groups, super patriots, who made it their business to locate the most dangerous elements in their society, conspirators, communist conspirators, and call attention to the fact in the public schools, on the newspapers, or in the pulpits, because they jump preachers too. Preacher's nothing but a commie preacher. And usually you drop dead after that. I mean, you became socially and politically a dead issue if they pointed their finger at you. And in the radio and television industry, there evolved this group called Aware Incorporated. Aware Incorporated was a private organization of performers and from Hollywood and New York and private business people who made it their business to combat the communist conspiracy in the radio and television industry. Now, in order to take that was their motto. They had red, white, and blue stationery with the eagles clutching flags on each side of it. And their motto was an organization to combat the communist conspiracy in radio and television industry, but that presumed two things. Number one, that there was a communist conspiracy in the radio and television industry, and number two, that Aware was the proper organization to combat it. Well, I accepted neither one of those presumptions. I lived there in New York. I lived along Madison Avenue, and if you'd seen the spineless bunch of jellyfish that ran the radio and television industry, you'd know there was very little likelihood that anybody was capable of getting up a plot to go to the men's room, let alone to overthrow the United States of America. All the programs broadcast over network radio and later television, because when I first got there wasn't anything but radio, see, in 1946 after World War II, were very carefully edited, and the thought that they were part of a communist conspiracy was pretty absurd to me, but not to those who believed that there was one. And you could get on that. The way Aware combated the communist conspiracy in radio and television was to periodically, about once a month, put out a bulletin listing the names of performers who had in the past done something that Aware had found out about, that had marched in a parade, who had signed a petition, who had attended a social gathering of some time or another, or gone to hear John Henry Faulk speak at Iowa State University. Some communist activity like that could they could list about them, and then Aware would say, now we're not saying this is a sign this person is actually an active member of the conspiracy, but we're calling your attention to the fact anyone whose name appeared on those Aware bulletins, in those Aware bulletins, became unemployable. They became, for all practical purposes, blacklisted. That is, none of the networks, none of the advertising agencies would touch them. Many, many hundreds of the people that were listed like that didn't even know they had been listed. And of course that violates, because Aware was a vigilante group, it violates one of the very basic principles of justice in our society, one of your basic constitutional rights, that if you're charged with the violation of the law, if you're charged with wrongdoing, you have a right to be confronted by the charges, to know who your accusers are, and to cross-examine your accusers. You can get a lawyer and confront them in court. But you see, the way Aware operated, you never knew who your accusers were. You never even knew what you were accused of till you found you weren't working, mostly. And if the word got around that you were blacklisted, that Aware had you on the list, there was something you could do about it. You could get your lawyer or your business manager to go to Aware and say, listen, you've got the wrong sow body here. This guy here, good God, he's not a communist. He's not political at all. He hasn't got any mind. He's a Republican, for goodness sake. I don't mean that follows. I mean that it's completely absurd for you to have this person on the list. And Aware would say, well, if that's true, we certainly want to rectify that error, and we'll check this out. We'll see. And if it's true that if this girl sang the Star Spangled Banner at that meeting, and we have found it to be a communist meeting, now she's going to have to tell us who took her to that meeting and why they took her. And you say, oh, well, she'll be glad to do that. Your business manager would say, oh, yes. And Aware would say, now there will be a charge for this fee. We charge a fee for this service that we're performing. It's a patriotic service, but we have to live, and then depending on who the person was and how much money they could spend, Aware would charge them to clear that person's name. Aware would check in and say, well, we found that they don't have a notable communist record, and so we will let them remove their name from the list, and they can go back to work. Well, as you can see, this led to a racket, and that's what I discovered it to be, nothing more than a racket. All of us had to belong to unions. I had to belong to Screen Actors Guild, and after American Federation of Radio and Television Artists. And the union was split right down the middle. Both unions were split down the middle by this great fight over the communist conspiracy and blacklisting. I felt that the union should take steps to stop blacklisting, to put an end to it, because it was manifestly unjust. It cost hundreds of decent, warm friends of mine their careers. They literally became unemployable. Now, by belly crawling or by paying Aware money, you could get out. But if you didn't do that, you simply had to choose another career, go to selling shoes at Macy's or slicing salami at a delicatessen to survive. And I felt that the union should take a position. The main union I belonged to was AFTRA. And so I got together during an election and said, let's all run against this Aware Incorporated. Let's run against their slate of officers. They ran a regular slate of officers in the union that supported their blacklisting. And if you got up and publicly denounced blacklisting angels, believe us or not, you could be accused of being part of this communist conspiracy that was laying its bony hand on the throat of America. And you became suspect. If you publicly criticized J. Edgar Hoover, if you publicly criticized the House Un-American Activities Committee, you could seem to be part of this, you see. Well, I come, as I've just told you in that chicken snake story, from a very courageous background. Hard-hitting frontier type. Shoot 'em up courage. As a matter of fact, I'm going to make a public confession right now. My actions, something that I'll describe in just a moment, were described by my lawyer, Louis Nizer, as the acts of a very courageous man. One lone man in America had the guts and the fortitude and the integrity and the belief in this republic to stand up and confront these scoundrels. And I started believing that for a while, and when he said it, I like broke into tears, and the jury did too. And I took it for granted that was right. As a matter of fact, there wasn't anything to it. It took no courage whatever to do what I did. I ran in the union. Incidentally, the president of my other union was a gentleman named Ronald Reagan. And he was one of the informers for Aware. He sent names into the House Committee and to the FBI of his fellow performers to make sure that they got blacklisted, that it cost them their careers. And this was established in my case. And the upshot was that Aware put out a bulletin on me. And this is a scary thing, you know, because they haven't charged you with anything. There's 7 things that I was supposed to have done. 4 of them were absolutely false, had nothing to do with me. 3 of them were true. And I'll tell you what one of them was so you'll get a notion of the level of their charges. According to a record, an official record, John Henry Faulk appeared at a dinner at the Astor Hotel under the sponsorship of a pro-communist organization with a known communist and has not repudiated the action since. And this was 10 years before that I'd done this. I looked it up and turned out they were absolutely right. It was a dinner at the Astor Hotel for the year 1 birthday party of the Security Council of the United Nations. Aware hadn't said that in their bulletin. That it was whether there was under the sponsorship of any communist or not, there were 33 different organizations, national organizations that sponsored it, like that well-known left-wing outfit called the American Bar Association, and National YMCA and YWCA, and a whole bunch of national organizations. The principal speaker there that night had been Edward Stettinius, the Secretary of State of the United States. The sponsors of it, two sponsors of it, was Mrs. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, wife of the former President of the United States, and Mr. Harold Ickes, a former cabinet member of the Interior, Secretary of the Interior. And the whole thing was broadcast full network over CBS. But there was a communist there, and I mean a full-blooded one, just as un-American as you can get, by the name of Mr. Andrei Gromyko. He was there representing the Soviet Union. And children, if y'all have seen him fall on those American capitalist victuals, you'd realize that he was eating the first real good meal he'd eaten in years. Or he impressed me as having doing so. I didn't meet him. I didn't get a chance to meet him, but I was there at the meeting, and that part of the charge was true. This is the level of nonsense that they would put out, you see. And ordinarily, you would never even see that. I got hold of this thing. I went down and got a lawyer, a very mean lawyer. Well, CBS, see, was very alarmed because I was making a lot of money for myself and for CBS at the time. And they said, you take this thing and you answer it and you explain that you were hoodwinked into doing these things. You didn't realize they were part of the communist conspiracy, and you apologize for having done them, and you take an oath that you'll never do them again, and maybe we can get Aware off your back. And those that you didn't do at all, that Ware made a mistake on, will say that you admire Ware's good works, but it simply was, this was a case of them being mistaken, that you weren't involved in them at all. But don't hurt their feelings, for goodness sakes. Don't upset a Ware, because they won't turn you loose if you do. Well, I went home and looked at that thing, and I started thinking of who we really are as an American people, whether I could answer it, whether I could write out an affidavit and explain all of that. And then I realized, well, of course I couldn't do that. They were saying things they had no right to say. But these weren't charges. They hadn't charged me with any criminal action. They hadn't gone down and filed charges against me. That this was their whole method. That the only thing they had on me was fear. That if I was afraid of them, then I'd start trying to explain, well, I really didn't do this as a communist, and I really hate communists just as bad as y'all do, and this kind of thing is the way you cleared yourself. Practically every politician in the United States at that time, for those of you that are old enough to remember that period, will remember that every important politician, liberal or conservative in this country, who made a public speech on radio or television started out by saying, I hate communism, and I am not a communist. Now and then, but the price of corn in Iowa just won't do. We've got to do something to jack the price of it up. Whatever subject he's going to talk about, he always prefaced it with that statement. I'm not a communist, and I hate them just as much as you do. This was the result of fear. Well, what happened was I got this lawyer, and he was a mean rascal. And he didn't like Ware either, because he'd handled some of the cases that they'd worked on out in Hollywood. He knew a great deal about their shakedown racket, that they were nothing more than patriotic racketeers, racketeering on patriotism, which isn't something new in this country. And it hasn't gone out altogether out of style yet. And we filed a suit against him, and I got fired from CBS, and I was unemployed. I was blacklisted for 6 years. And being blacklisted is very uncomfortable unless you come from my family. I come from a family of kinfolk visitors. My Aunt Edith used to bring her 4 children, come up at Thanksgiving. I remember Mama would say, oh, Edith, it's so good to see you and children. We're just going to have a big Thanksgiving dinner today, and you got here in time for it. I'm just so pleased. And can't you stay over the weekend now? Don't go back tomorrow or the next day. Stay over Sunday, and let's have a good old gossip session. And then he'd say, oh, Miss Maddie, I just think it's so tacky to impose on people like that. I just don't want to be in the way. I suppose if you got some old quilts, the children could sleep on pallets, and I'll sleep out in the car. And Mama would say, Edith, we have worlds of room, and just delighted to have you. And they'd go through this for a few minutes, and they needed to move in. Aunt Edith would usually leave about Easter. This is an old Southern custom that we practiced in our family. Ware didn't know that I had practiced that and was an artist at it. So I went home and visited kinfolks when I got unemployed and was driven up against the wall in New York City. It's a very uncomfortable feeling, and I don't mean to make light of it. It's hell to be blacklisted. As you don't know who you're fighting. You don't know why you're turned down for a job. Is it something political, or am I really unsuitable for it, or is my talent really not up to snuff? And it'll drive you absolutely crazy. It's a very, very, well, Johnny Randolph was here telling you about it, I think, but he was blacklisted too. And a lot of some of the finest people in this country suffered under the blacklist. But 6 years later, we go to court in New York, and Nizer has assembled perhaps the most definitive library on blacklisting, the racketeering aspects of it, that's ever been assembled. And this was the great trial of the first time, really, that the inner workings of the McCarthy period were going to be revealed in a public court under sworn evidence. And so there was very widespread interest in it, and in Hollywood and in New York too, and every day the courtrooms were filled. And every day Nizer would put the juice to them, and the case lasted 3 months. And Nizer had me up there parading me in front of him. I wish y'all could have seen me as a witness. I was supposed to be very red, white, and blue. See, Nizer wanted to make sure that they didn't mistake me for a communist. or communist sympathizer. So he talked about my Methodist background in Texas and what a clean-cut, fine Christian boy I was, and all the sundry things that I was supposedly have done, which interested me a lot. I don't think it was of slightest interest to anyone else. But this was his way of throwing off the onus of me being suspect, you see. And I remember once he said, "Johnny, you've got to come up with something you did outstanding, some grade you made, some honor you received in school before you graduated from high school." Well, I called my family down in Texas. I called some of my ex-school teachers. I said, "Can you all ever remember me winning anything or getting an award for anything?" No. And I couldn't come up with a thing. Finally, I came up with one and told Nizer, and the next day he said, "Now, when I'm taking you through direct testimony tomorrow, you mention this. We want this on the record, and I want that jury to hear it." Well, the next day I'm sitting up there running off my mouth, and the press table was down in front of us, and it was completely filled every day. The paper was about 6 different papers were covering this, and he gets up to my 12th year, taking me through his testimony, and I forgot it. I forgot what I was supposed to testify. What I was supposed to say. And I could see he was annoyed. And he said, "Well, now, Mr. Falk, that award you just mentioned, or that you were mentioning in your 12th year," I remembered. But the other lawyer was up saying that he's leading that witness. The witness can't remember the lies he's supposed to tell. Well, you need that it's not his lawyer's business to testify for him. "I object, Your Honor." And the judge said, "Well, were you going to testify about a warrant?" I said, "Yes, sir, I thought I mentioned it." "Well, go ahead and do it, and let's get this case moving. You're wasting too much time here." So Nizer said, "All right, now, Mr. Falk, take your time. Tell us slowly, what was that award?" And I said, "It was an award of a silver star I received for 72 Sundays of attendance at the Fred Allen Memorial Methodist Sunday School without a single miss." And old Murray Kempton was sitting there at the press table. He was there for the New York Post at the time. He threw his hand over his mouth like he was going to vomit. And I was a little nauseous myself. But Nizer beamed like I'd said that was the year I got the Nobel Prize for being virtuous and good. It pleased his mischief. This was the kind of trial he ran. This was the kind of picture of me that he sought to print. And then he summed it all up at the end of the trial, talking about me. And all of a sudden, I got mad at those people for the first time. You see, they were impersonal to me. I wasn't mad at them. I was mad at what was being done to my society. And I didn't think I was taking a courageous action. I was doing what I felt any American citizen would do who really understands what this country is all about, who we really are as citizens and responsible members of a democratic republic such as we live in, a self-governing society such as we live in. This was what was offended about me, and it didn't take courage to take action against them. But Nizer had it as an act of great courage, and he got describing it, and damn if I didn't believe it. I was beginning to swell out my chest about all this courage I'd had in fighting this lone, battle-only man in the entire United States that would stand up and point my finger right in their faces and call them scoundrels. And it sounded good. And then he asked for $2 million. And that embarrassed me because we were just suing for $1 million, and I thought he'd gotten a little carried away and that the jury would take him not seriously. And we went out to wait for the jury to come back in, and I was kind of arguing with him. I said, that's $2 million. They'll think it's a joke. My feelings were hurt, but Lord, Lyndon Johnson's feelings couldn't be hurt $2 million worth. And, he knew what he was talking about. In a little while, here comes a runner from the court saying the jury's coming back in. The judge wants you all in the courtroom. We go back in, and the judge asked the jury if they've reached a decision, and the foreman got up and said, "No, we want to ask a question in open court. Can we give more than $2 million?" Old Nizer looked like somebody caught him between the eyes with a ball-peen hammer. He'd made a lot of mistakes, but asking for too little never had been one of them. I was just stunned by the whole thing, and they went out and came back in 30 minutes with a $3.5 million judgment. If y'all want to have something, if you want to have something, I don't care how long you've been plagued by asthma or falling hair or dandruff or whatever, you let a jury come in and award you a $3.5 million judgment, and it has the most therapeutic effect on every ache and pain in your body. And this put me back in the national limelight. This broke the back of blacklisting, because blacklisting, that was a signal that blacklisting any networks or advertising agencies that participated in this regrettable practice of blacklisting performers could be subjected to a fine, and a very heavy one. It could cost them money. And that takes you to be amazed at how that reduces their patriotic fervor. It reduces it to zero. And we broke the back of blacklisting, and Nizer made these wonderful speeches on me. And one night I was on Johnny Carson's show, and Johnny was introducing me as this great hero. It was like I tried to put old Shelley up to doing with me then. I said, tell him what a hero and a courageous man I am. And Shelley just couldn't bring herself to lie. She just said, he's courageous. With total lack of conviction. But at any rate, it gives a point to my story as the reason I wanted her to do it. It wasn't because I believe it myself. But at any rate, I was on Johnny Carson's show, and Johnny Carson went through this thing of talking about, he read the New York Times editorial on what a heroic fight I'd fought for all the people of America, for those precious liberties that we cherish and love. And I'd stood up to this bunch, and nobody else would stand up to them. And it was such courage that it almost choked him up. And so I said, Johnny, I appreciate that very much, but let me correct something, just as a matter of history, and also because I think it's very important that the American people understand this, that this wasn't an act of courage. And then I told the chicken snake story. I said, my courage hasn't improved a darn bit since that chicken snake ran me out of the hen house. I don't lay any claims to courage. I certainly lay none to heroism. It was an act of a responsible American citizen. I had one advantage that a lot of people in this country don't have, and any of them that have it can act on it usually. I understood who the men were who founded this republic and what this republic is all about. What a work of genius they performed when they framed the Constitution of the United States of America and the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights. That's where the heroism is. That's where the real courage was. That's where the real vision and wisdom was. Not in me. I was a Madison Avenue nonentity, and still am for that matter. And let's get that very straight. And I thought this, it's sweet to be modest. Mom had always taught me that, and so I was being sufficiently modest. And I was hoping he wouldn't agree with me too much, but he did. He said, yes, I see what you're saying, but I still think you're courageous. Yes, I did. And the minute I got off there, here comes 3, not 1, but 3 NBC pages rushing out and saying, you're wanted on the phone at once, Mr. Nizer, it's an emergency. Come to the phone at once. And I went rushing in. I thought maybe I had heart failure or something. And went in, and in the coldest voice you can imagine, children, deadly serious, he says, I never want to hear you say again that you're not a hero. See, I've gone through that. I have no tendency to heroics and that sort of thing. And I'm certainly not courageous. And he said, never say that again. You are a hero. You're an American hero. The American people need a hero like you. And never, never again publicly say that you're not. And if that wasn't an act of courage. And he meant it. He was deadly serious about it, and there was no question whatever. And I came to understand why. He realized that was a good example. The American people should have an example that there's really nothing to standing up for the principles and ideals upon which this republic is founded, that are the very underpinnings of our society. And that is the burden of what I wanted to say to you all. What the McCarthy period was about hysteria and fear when it became the dominant characteristic of our society. That is not what founded America, and that is not what has sustained America. It's still with us. This kind of thing is still going on in our society. McCarthyism hasn't been cured entirely. And it's why it's very important to make the point that I'm making. We are very privileged people. And to write us off as we've got to be taught to recite the Pledge of Allegiance to the United States of America as one of the first acts of citizenship, and to go through this nonsense and hullabaloo about patriotism, and you ain't as patriotic as me, and so you better stay out of my way or I'll get you. And I've heard that you're a dues-paying member of the ACLU. And all of this kind of stuff is to reduce the rational, intelligent, political dialogue which the people of this country depend on to govern themselves. We're entitled to it. It's to reduce it to a triviality and something silly and ridiculous. The real issues that are before us are multitudinous enough if we discuss them head on. And usually when people engage in that kind, politicians engage in that kind of palaver, they're avoiding coming to grips with the real issues that confront the American people and don't want to take a position on those issues before the American people. That's the reason I think it's absolutely crucial that we re-examine something, and everybody in this room can do that. Re-examine your Constitution. Read James Madison notes on the Constitutional Convention of 1787. When those men, just 55 of them, spent a whole summer long sweating, slapping mosquitoes and swatting flies there in Philadelphia, and framed that charter of government, the likes of which never existed before. They had no model to go by. Created that miracle at Philadelphia. And on 17th of September, 1787, declared to the world those words that had never been heard anywhere in all the history of man. We, the people of the United States of America, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for a common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity, to ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States of America. Angels, you are the posterity they were talking about. And if you'll reflect for a moment on our contemporary politics, and you won't have to do it for more than a moment to realize that you haven't heard anyone talking about posterity in this country in the last 40 years. I haven't. Saying we must do this for posterity. This is our obligation to posterity. The men who presented us these beautiful rights on a silver platter understood them because they had lived under tyranny. They knew what it was like to have your door kicked in. They knew what it was like to run a printing press and have the government come in and chop it to pieces, throw you in jail. They knew what it was like to sit in prison endless lengths of time without any charges being brought against you. They understood tyranny. They had lived under it on the King George and Lord North and that hideous parliament of that day. And they were determined to set up a society that would be as nearly free from those tyrannous attributes as they could make it. And when they sent this, and this is very important, people haven't reflected on this very often, when they sent this work of genius out to the 13 states to be voted on, have them ratify it. Several of the states, Massachusetts, Virginia, said, "Oh no, we won't ratify that unless it has a Bill of Rights in it." We had it under King George. Unless limits are placed on the government, certain things are made absolute that the government can't meddle in, certain personal freedoms and liberties are, we won't sign it.